All right, so we are moving on here with Goethe's Faust, part 2. And so here, these next few, so we have 2 scenes and then we have Act 3. And they're all very connected and interwoven. Goethe has deliberately interwoven them on the theme of Eros. Then in Act 4, we'll get back to Thanatos, the realm of fear and war, when the emperor has to go to war because the paper currency that Mephistopheles has introduced into his empire has destabilized it and caused rampant inflation. So he has to go to war. But right now, Goethe is focusing on these next 2 scenes and the third act, which is known as the Helena, on Eros. And so, in these 2 scenes of the classical Walpurgisnacht in particular, we have 2 transformations of Eros. There is the birth of a mountain that occurs at the beginning. And the mountain is, as it were, self-born. The earth simply gives birth to it. In other words, parthenogenetically, like Gaia at the opening of Hesiod's Theogony, where Gaia gives birth spontaneously to her mate, Uranos, the sky god, but also to Chaos and Tartaros and a whole host of divinities. And so we have that kind of a birth, the parthenogenetic birth, and the earth does give birth to rocks parthenogenetically. It doesn't require insemination. It just spontaneously gives birth through fire. And then in the second scene that we're going to look at here, the erotic act has to do with male-female coupling. Homunculus is perhaps we could think of him as male, although he is referred to at one moment as androgynous. But I think Goethe initially intended him to be a male. And then he throws himself, he's floating around in his glass alembic, and he sees Galatea, who is one of the Dorids. So the old man of the sea, Nereus, and there are 2 of them, Nereus and Proteus. The old man of the sea, Nereus, has given birth to 50 Dorids and 50 Nereids, and one of the Dorids is the sea nymph Galatea. And of course, Raphael is famous for having created one of his most beautiful paintings, The Triumph of Galatea, which Goethe is referring to as the apotheosis of all of these scenes. He's sort of mirroring that painting. And that's a male-female act when Homunculus, out of erotic desire, because he wants to incarnate in a physical body, hurls himself at her conch shell. She has borrowed Venus's conch shell, and he slams himself into it. And then he has to undergo evolution through the sea. First as bacteria, then as protists, then as multicellular organisms, and then fish, and the Cambrian explosion 500 million years ago, and so on. So he has to undergo evolution. And then in the Helena, Act 3, then, we have Helen, who has been resurrected for the second time up from the underworld, and she has come up, and then Faust has sex with her. He impregnates her, and they have a child together named Euphorion, who is doomed. He commits suicide. And so these are 3 different transformations. In these 2 scenes in Act 3, 3 different transformations of the principle of Eros. So sex is the main theme here, but sex in the broader sense of things coming into being. How do mountains and rocks come into being? How does life come into being? How do men and women have children? And so forth. That's the main theme in all of these 3. So they're very carefully woven together, and this is very dense reading. It's extraordinarily complex, and it requires a lot of thought. Now these last 2 scenes of the classical Walpurgisnacht are to be thought of as a pair. In the one case, we have fire as the predominant shaping creative force in this scene. In the next scene, we have water, then, which is the one Goethe favors as the creative primal force that brings life into being. And so we have the geological theories common in Goethe's time of volcanism on the one hand versus Neptunism on the other. And in volcanism, fire is thought to be the source for bringing things into being, whereas with Neptunism, it's water, but it moves slowly. Water takes its time, and Goethe favored the Neptunist theory. But as it turns out, both theories are true. The volcanist theory, and here we see, as this scene opens up on the upper Pygmies river, And here, so I've got a map. There are many islands mentioned, such as Samothrace, which is over here, and the Samothracian mysteries, which were second only to Eleusis for being the sacred mysteries of the classical world. And nearby was the island of Lemnos, which had to do with Hephaestus, the blacksmith, who was cast out from heaven, or from Olympus, let's say, and he went crashing into Lemnos. So the mysteries of the two were connected, Samothrace, and it was thought that the Samothracian divinities were the prototypes for the Olympian divinities. I doubt that theory holds much water these days, but that's what it was thought, especially in the time when Schelling, who was a close friend of Goethe's, and stayed with him for a while around the year 1800, wrote his treatise on the Samothracian divinities. So here we are in Thessaloniki. This is where we're at. Here's the Pygmies River as it goes along. Faust is on the lower Pygmies, and this scene with Mephistopheles is on the upper Pygmies. Then we will move in the next scene to the ocean, into the Aegean. It's called the Festival of the Aegean, or Rocky Inlets of the Aegean, but it's centered around a festival sacred to water as the creative principle. And then it will curve around and come down here in Act 3 when Helen returns to Sparta, when she comes up from the underworld, and she has just been brought to Sparta from the ocean and comes there for the entire phantasmagoria of Act 3, which is Faust's dalliance with her. So that's the trajectory that we're looking at here. So now, as this scene opens up, the earth, so the sirens come in, they form the chorus in this. They represent the principle of the air. All four elements will be united by the time we get to the end of the second scene. And the sirens come in, and they say, plunge into Pygmies flood. There we should be splashing, ranging, tuneful part song interchanging for the wretched people's good. Far from water, nothing thrives. And this is Goethe's thesis throughout, because he remained a Neptunist and believed that water was the primary principle that gave birth to things, and that volcanism and volcanic activity, all it does is destroy things. He was wrong about that. Far from water, nothing thrives. If we hastened all our host down to the Aegean coast, every bliss would grace our lives. That's where we're headed, to the Aegean coast, so that's what's going to happen over the course of these two scenes. Then it says earthquake. And now note that in the Romantic or the Nordic Walpurgisnacht, we had a central mountain there, the cosmic mountain archetype, the Brocken, namely, where Mephistopheles and Faust ascended up it. Here we have the birth of a mountain, an artificial mountain, which Goethe named Seismos, after one of the epithets of Poseidon, who was the god of earthquakes. And it should be noted, too, and this is relevant, that Poseidon was originally not a water god. He was brought down to the peninsula here by Indo-Europeans as an earth god. His name was Poseidos, which means Lord of the Earth. And his trident that he has, and we'll see it turn up in the next scene, was probably then originally a thunderbolt. He was probably a thunder-hurling god. Many of the Indo-European gods, when their thunderbolts are depicted, they look like tridents, actually. They have a central bolt with two side bolts coming out from either side, and so it is very possible that Poseidon's trident is a transformed and disguised thunderbolt, and that will have some relevance when it appears in the next scene. So there's an earthquake, and then the water of the Pygmies spontaneously then gives birth to this mountain, and so it's like something out of Hesiod's Theogony, and so this is the earth giving birth out of volcanism, which accounts for the formation of the early crust and of the earth, granite and basalt and so forth. And this is also then the principle of the earth giving birth parthenogenetically. It spontaneously brings its forms into being. And so Seismos comes up and he's personified as though it were a giant. One more shove, he says, but stronger, bolder. One more heave with mighty shoulder. Thus we rise through earth and boulder, up where all must give us way. And there is a reference to Hesiod on the next page. And then he is also referring to Delos, which is an island down here somewhere in the Cyclades, down here in this region, that was said to have been created by Poseidon and brought up from the depths of the ocean by Poseidon as a retreat for Leto, who was being pursued by Hera, because Zeus had sex with her. And Poseidon brought up the island of Delos, and it was there that she then gave birth to Zeus's progeny, Apollo and his sister Artemis, the mistress of the hunt, on that island. And so Goethe wants you to think of that. But it is parthenogenetic. And it also refers back to, on our geological timeline, the Hadean epoch, which is the Earth's oldest and earliest epoch, in which 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth was basically a fiery ball of magma with volcanic eruptions constantly taking place, and lava and meteorites crashing into the Earth. This is why it's named after Hades. It was Hadean. And and then so as we move along through the scene here, then we're back with the Sphinxes and the Griffins, which, as we recall, represent the bedrock of Greek myth, the earliest phase of it. And here we've got the bedrock of the Earth with the Hadean epoch. And then the Sphinxes and the Griffins are talking. And the Griffins, whose job is to guard gold, when Seismos comes up, he comes up with veins of gold inside of him. And the giant ants that we saw earlier, and ants are left over from the Cretaceous period. They're about 100 million years old. So the ants too refer to an earlier epoch that has survived into our present day. Ants are basically unchanged for 100 million years. And the chorus of ants come in, and they spot the gold. The griffins spot the gold and tell them about it. Then the ants start mining it. And then we get a group of Pygmies who comes in. And now, so it's worth noting that all the mythological beings that appear in these two scenes are minor beings. Goethe does not invoke or have present on stage any of the fundamental Olympian deities. Instead of Aphrodite, we get her half shell, her clam shell. Instead of Poseidon, we get his trident. These are signifiers that stand in for the deities themselves. But the Greek deities that do appear, like the Pygmies here, and this is a manifestation, an image of one of the Pygmies, are minor. And they're nature spirits, like Nereids and Tritons that appear in the next scene. Here, Pygmies. And they all tend to be short, small in stature, like the dactyls. Pygmies, dactyls. And they refer back, of course, to the gnomes of the carnival scene that we saw at the beginning of part 2, where the emperor was disguised as Pan and Faust was Plutus. And then a contingent of gnomes representing the dwarves out of Scandinavian mythology, who are miners and blacksmiths. And so the Pygmies here in Greek mythology are their equivalents. So Goethe is constantly trying to link Nordic mythical figures with their equivalent figures amongst the Greeks. So they come in, and the Pygmies immediately enslave the ants to mine the gold for them, and they bring in the dactyls, which are supposedly dactyl means finger, and so they were the size of fingers, tiny little creatures, but they were also blacksmiths. And so the Pygmies bring in the dactyls, and then they go to war against the cranes of Ibycus, which refers to a ballad by Schiller, the cranes of Ibycus. And these cranes come in, these birds come flying in, and the Pygmies and the cranes go to war against each other over possession of the gold. And so once again, this links back to the gold that Mephistopheles has claimed lies as the backing for the paper currency in the emperor's land. But it also, of course, once again refers to the gold of alchemy, that the whole epic here is in the process of bringing the gold up from the depths of the unconscious into a realized conscious formation. That's what this epic is about. And so they go to war here, and the war sort of looks ahead then to when we return to Thanatos, when we return to war in Act 4. It's looking ahead to that, as well as linking back to the carnival with the gnomes. And then Mephistopheles shows up, and he's nostalgic for the Brocken. And he shows up, and now, so the sexual theme here manifests in this chapter with Mephistopheles trying to have sex with all these Thessalian witches, these Lamii, and Empusa. They're all Thessalian witches, and they taunt him and torment him, and his desire is continually frustrated. So we have the sex theme here, and it was really the only reason why Mephistopheles agreed to go along in the first place, was so he could, get laid with Thessalian witches. But it doesn't work out. They just make fun of him. And then after a while, Homunculus floats by, And remember, his quest is that he's looking to incarnate. So there's another erotic motif there. He's looking to incarnate into a physical form. He says, I float like this from place to place, keen on the finest manner of becoming. I cannot wait to smash my glass and flare, but judging by the morning's slumming, to venture into this, I hardly dare. So he's talking to Mephistopheles, and then he floats off. And he says he's specifically, though, looking for two pre-Socratic philosophers, Anaxagoras and Thales. And so now Goethe moves us into another epoch, another world age from the world age of Greek myth, in the realm of, not the Olympians because they don't appear, but the realm of Greek myth into the world of pre-Socratic philosophy. And Thales is regarded as the first, he's the 6th century BC, and his idea is that all things emerge from water. And he supposedly got this idea after taking a journey to Egypt, where in Egypt, of course, cosmologically, the entire world and all the gods had come into being from out of the watery abyss, which they called Nun. And so it's suspected that Thales got this idea that everything originates from water from the Egyptians. And then we have the philosopher Anaxagoras, who stands in here. I'm not sure that the actual Anaxagoras ever said this, but that Goethe has him as the representative of fire, as the fundamental creative force. And the two of them are going back and forth, and Anaxagoras, and Homunculus is looking for them because he thinks that one of them will have the key. They'll know how he can incarnate in physical form. And so Anaxagoras says, that cliff, and he's referring to Seismos, which has now just been born, that cliff exists by dint of swathes of flame. That's volcanism. Thales says, it is in moisture, though, that life became. Which is, both are true. Flame is required. Volcanic activity brings granite and basalt into being. Igneous rocks, whereas sedimentary rocks come into being from water, but also living things. You can't have living things without water, but you can't have any of that without the Earth's crust being formed. So that has to be made first. And then Homunculus says, hey, admit me to your company. I too aspire to come to be. And so they're talking, and Anaxagoras and Thales are going back and forth, talking. And then Anaxagoras sees that now the moon, he actually prays to the moon in its triple goddess form as Diana, Luna, Hecate. Hecate is sort of linked with witches. So he sort of prays to the moon, and the moon at this point in the narrative stops at its zenith and freezes, as though this were a night that could last forever. And so once again, it's Goethe toying with the epic's main theme about Faust looking for the one moment that he would wish to last forever. This is a night that perhaps he would wish to last forever. And so Anaxagoras, though, sees that a meteorite is approaching, and he thinks he's caused it to come into being, and it's approaching, and it's headed for his beloved mountain Seismos that he's so proud of. So he says a prayer to the moon goddess. It doesn't do any good. The meteorite crashes into the mountain and kills all the cranes and all the Pygmies, which is Goethe's statement on war, which is, whichever side you're on, it doesn't matter. All fire does is destroy life. It can't bring life into being, is Goethe's thesis. He's wrong about that because it brought the Earth's crust into being upon which life and water depend for their existence. Not only that, but we now know that during the late heavy bombardment of about 4.5 billion years ago, meteorites brought water to the Earth in the form of frozen ice crystals that just kept bombarding until the Earth's ocean was formed. So Goethe was wrong about that. Both are true. Both volcanism and Neptunism are correct for different reasons and pertaining to different areas of the chain of being. And so Anaxagoras then falls out of the picture, and Homunculus realizes that he wants to hang out with Thales, and that Thales is probably the guy here who can lead him to how he can incarnate on the physical plane. And so then we then see Thales, Homunculus, and then Mephistopheles comes in. He has been, this is one of the creatures that has been tempting him, a lamia. But we've moved past that scene, and so now a Dryad shows up, which is a tree nymph, a wood nymph. She shows up and points him in the direction of the Phorkyads. And the Phorkyads are also known as the Grii, and they represent the principle of pure ugliness. So they are the offspring, the three offspring of Phorkys, whose identity Mephistopheles assumes in this scene. And the whole point of this scene, he shows up and he says, how come you have never been represented in sculpture, in Greek art? And they say, oh, we don't care. But it's because this is the land of Winkelmannian beauty, noble grandeur, and calm repose, whatever it is. And beauty is the primary ideal here. And so the Greeks never represented something as ugly as the Graeae in their sculpture. But they say they don't care. They have one eye. They share one eye and they share one tooth. And so Mephistopheles says, hey, can I borrow those? I want to borrow those. And so they represent the principle of ugliness in opposition to both Galatea and Helen. But he takes on the identity of their father, Phorcys, for Act 3, when he will show up at Menelaus's palace in Sparta, where then he will talk to Helen. She representing the principle of ideal beauty, he representing pure ugliness. And the ugly and the sublime are not the same thing. Don't confuse them. They're not the same thing. I've heard people confuse them. The sublime has to do with power, not ugliness. Okay. So then we move to the next scene, the Neptunist, the celebration of the creative power of water. And this is the apotheosis of the classical Walpurgisnacht. It's one of the most beautiful things Goethe has ever written, and I think it's the best part of the epic. So here, as the scene opens, we're at rocky inlets of the Aegean Sea. So we've left the Thessalian plain with its witches behind. Now we're down on the shores of the Aegean. And the moon is at rest at the zenith. It's frozen. It's simply stopped at its zenith. It's not full, but it's stopped. And then the sirens come in once again as our chorus. And then we have these Nereids and Tritons. And here is a picture of Nereids and Tritons. The Nereids are the 50 daughters of the old man of the sea, Nereus. And so they are the female figures here. And then the Tritons are the offspring of Poseidon. We don't have Poseidon. Instead, we have stand-ins for Poseidon, namely his Tritons. None of the Olympians appear. None of the great Greek gods appear in these scenes. I'm not sure what Goethe's reason for that is, but it works. He makes it work beautifully. So the sirens are going back and forth with the Nereids and the Tritons, and they're talking, and their job, so everything is going to lead here bit by bit as Goethe pieces the equipment together to the apotheosis at the end of this scene, which ends the classical Walpurgisnacht with his equivalent of Raphael's Triumph of Galatea. It was one of the 50 Dorids, one of the nymphs also of Nereus. So he has 50 Dorids and 50 Nereids. And the job of the Nereids and the Tritons right now is to go to the island of Samothrace, where, as we have mentioned when we started, the Samothracian mysteries took place, and bring back 4 of the 7 Samothracian gods. And according to Schelling, they correspond to Demeter, Persephone, Pluto, and Hermes. They're like the prototypes. And once again, the Kabiri are dwarves. They're always represented as dwarves. So their job is to go and get these Kabiri as part of the festival, part of the ceremonial festival. And so Talus and Homunculus are wandering along, and they bump into Nereus, and Talus says, hey, this guy here, Homunculus, doesn't have a body, and he's looking for a body. Can you help him? And Nereus is a complete grouch, as Goethe imagines him. He's a total grouch. He says, no, I'm too busy with my daughters getting ready for the festival. I can't help you guys. That's not going to happen. And so they talk to him, and he says, what you really need to do is find Proteus, who's the other old man of the sea. Whereas Nereus represents the sea in its constancy and its eternity, its ancient, ageless stillness. Proteus constantly transforms and metamorphoses into one image, animal, deity after the next. And so he's a trickster, and you have to catch him. He's very difficult to catch, but if you can catch him and trap him, then he has to tell you truth, which he does. But here they don't need to do that because, as it turns out, Proteus will be so fascinated with Homunculus that they won't have to try and catch him. And so Nereus says, so I'm getting ready for the festival. Go find Proteus. In opal flesh of Venus's shell coach gliding, now comes the fairest of his Dorids, his daughters, Galatea, riding, who, since the Cyprian, that's Venus, born from the island of Cyprus, who, since the Cyprian's face was turned elsewhere, won Paphos' awe and reigns as goddess there. Thus ever after she was owned the fairest, both temple town and chariot throne as heiress. So we don't have Venus. We have her stand-in, this beautiful sea nymph Galatea. And then so Talus says, okay, we'll head off. So in come back our chorus, the sirens who are flying around, these birds with female heads, human heads, and then the Nereids and the Tritons, and they say, well, we are bringing in Colone's huge shell here, and Colone here, as represented in this image, was a nymph who was transformed into a tortoise by Hermes. Recall, too, that Hermes' lyre was made from a tortoise's shell, and so they're going to get her shell, and they're bringing it in because they're going to bring the Kabiri from the island of Samothrace on this shell. And the shell, as Carl Karenyi points out, is cosmic. In India, the entire cosmos rests on the back of a giant tortoise, which then transforms in Mesoamerica as all this migrates across the Pacific basin there into the back of a crocodile. The mountains correspond to the bumps on the back of a crocodile. Same image. So they're going to bring in the Kabiri, and they do bring them, 4 of them. 3 of them are missing, but they bring 4 and to take place in the festivities. They're extremely sacred divinities. And so, here's an image of the Kabiri from a book on Amazon, The Great Gods of Samothrace. Here, once again, they're depicted as these little dwarves. I'm not sure exactly how it was, or by what process they were supposed to have become the prototypes for the Olympians, but I don't think it works. So then they back to Talus and Homunculus, and now they find Proteus. They bump into him, and he is being elusive as usual. He's pretending he's near, and his voice is far, and Talus is like, I know you're here. Hey, look. Hey, wait a minute. Check this guy out. You've never seen anything like this guy. This little dwarf in a tube that glows luminously. And of course, it does fascinate Proteus, and he comes back and goes, wow, what is that? And so he doesn't do his usual routine of transforming into different shapes, and you have to catch him. He's caught by the bait of Homunculus, whom he finds so fascinating that he comes back. And both he and Talus say, okay, yeah, what you have to do is descend into the ocean and evolve. So Goethe was fully well aware here in 1832 that life had evolved from the ocean from simpler, less complex forms to more and more complex forms and eventually into humans. He already knew that. Lots of people knew that. Darwin wasn't in any way, shape, or form the first to come up with the theory of evolution. He was only the first, or at least at the same time as Alfred Russel Wallace, to come up with the theory of evolution by natural selection, which is a total sham. It's a materialist, mechanist version of evolution that's bullshit. Natural selection is not creative. It's an editing force that edits. It doesn't create. But here Goethe knew, and so Proteus says, the more assuredly then it thrives. He's referring to Homunculus as a hermaphrodite. He'll suit whichever form arrives. No need to ponder this a minute. In the broad sea, you must begin it. There first the tiny way you try, in other words, as little microorganisms, bacteria, and protists. Thus you grow larger by and by into, let's say, the Cambrian explosion of little tiny fish and the first arthropods and vertebrates. Thus you grow larger by and by and shape yourself for higher doing. So this is what Proteus tells him, that you're going to have to, if you want to form, and especially if you want a human form, you're going to have to descend into the depths of the sea and undergo evolution bit by bit. And so then the Telchines come in. They come from the island of Rhodes, which is famous for having a gigantic statue, I suppose the ancient world's equivalent of the Statue of Liberty, which fell in an earthquake. And the Telchines come in now on seahorses and sea dragons, wielding Neptune's trident. Neptune does not appear. In place of Neptune, we get his trident. And the chorus of Telchines says, "'Tis we who have fashioned," they're blacksmiths too, like the Kabiri, "'tis we who have fashioned Poseidon's great trident, the billows to soothe in their turmoil most strident. When clouds are split wide by the thunderers unfolding," and the thunderer refers to Zeus. But now, we started out here with me pointing out that The trident is probably a thunderbolt that has been displaced from a land god, an Indo-European land god, to a sea god. When clouds are split wide by the thunderer's unfolding, Poseidon replies to the terrible rolling. What glare from on high may be jaggedly flashed, there's wave upon wave from below, for it splashed, almost as though the thunderbolts of Zeus hit the waters, the female waters of Poseidon. And there used to be old evolutionary theories that thought in the 19th century that life came into being from lightning striking water, striking the ocean. And what in between may have quakingly wallowed, long tossed by the nethermost depth, it is swallowed. Wherefore he has lent us the scepter today, and carefree we float now, all festive and gay. And so we're on the way here toward the triumph of Galatea. Bit by bit, they keep bringing in little bits and pieces, the trident, the tortoiseshell, the Kabiri, that will form her apotheosis and procession. Then Proteus transforms himself into a dolphin because he agrees to sort of be the midwife in a way for Homunculus's incarnation into physical matter. And so he's a dolphin, but of course, as we'll see in a moment, Raphael's painting is full of dolphins. And so in comes the dolphin. So bit by bit, we're assembling Raphael's painting. Oh, and I do want to mention this in case I forget that with regard to Raphael now, there's a bit of trivia from Rudolf Steiner, who claimed that Novalis was the reincarnation of Raphael. And indeed, if you look up a self-portrait of Raphael and an image of Novalis, they look almost identical. And so Novalis was a poet who Goethe knew, who hung out in the same circles in Jena right around 1800, and he wrote Heinrich von Ofterdingen, and he died very young, just like a year after finishing it in the 1820s, I think it was, which introduces the romantic motif of the blue flower. Interesting to know, though, that Goethe is spending all this time and energy in 1830 writing his literary equivalent of Raphael's Triumph of Galatea when he had actually known Raphael's reincarnation as Novalis, if Steiner is correct, and I believe that he is. Okay, so then moving along here to the Apotheosis, with Homunculus riding on the back of the dolphin that is Proteus, and then the sirens are announcing the coming in of the doves, the doves of Venus. So we don't get Venus, we get her half shell and we get her doves. And so we're moving toward the Apotheosis, okay, so with regard to the half shell, Venus on the half shell, we all know Botticelli's painting. Here's a much, much older composition that it's loosely based on. This is Apelles, or a copy or an echo of an Apelles painting from the ancient world of Venus on the half shell, and you can see that the half shell is meant to represent a vagina. It's very clear. It's not clear in Botticelli or even in Raphael's painting, but it's very clear in Apelles' painting that the half shell was vaginal. And indeed, if you look at a conch shell, it looks like a vagina. And the idea then for Goethe is that when Homunculus throws himself at Galatea and riding on her shell, that it's a sexual impregnation. His alembic explodes in a mass of fire all over the shell, and it's meant to be a conjunctio, a sexual congress. So in come a group called Cillian Marci, who are creatures, they're men actually, primitive cavemen from the island of Cyprus. So we're moving up the chain of being here as they come in. And then the Dorids, Nereus shows up again with his daughters, the Dorids, of whom, of course, he brings Galatea, the most beautiful of them. And she shows up, and so here is the apotheosis of the entire classical Walpurgisnacht here, which is what Goethe is assembling, which is Raphael's Triumph of Galatea, which instead of Cupids, he's got the doves following her. But then we have all the tritons and the nereids and the dolphins, the half shell, the vaginal half shell there. Everything comes into being erotically. She is the principle of the beautiful, just like Helen, Eros. And then as the scene ends with Homunculus seeing her, falling in love with her, and he shatters himself in an orgasm on her half shell there, and now he will undergo evolution. He'll start as little tiny creatures and work his way up through fish to a fine human being. Goethe jokes earlier in the scene, like Talus, so somebody as fine as can be, And then the whole thing ends with this rapturous hymn to Eros, and everybody singing. And the sirens take us out as they brought us in as the chorus. What lights us the billows? What fiery wonder? Well, let's read the verse before it with Talus announcing what happens with Homunculus. He says, Homunculus is it, by Proteus ensnared. These symptoms betoken imperious craving, the clamorous drone of an agonized raving. He'll crash at her glittering throne and be shattered. It's flaming, now flashes, already is scattered. Then the sirens take us out. What lights us the billows? What fiery wonder sets blazing their clashes and sparkling asunder? It lightens and wavers and brightens the height. The bodies they glow on the courses of night, and ringed is the whole by the luminous wall. May Eros then reign who engendered it all. Hail the sea, the ocean swelling, wreathed in sacred fiery torrents. Hail the fire, the waters welling. Hail the singular occurrence. And then everybody on the stage sings. Hail the gentle airs benignant. Hail the deeps with secrets pregnant. Solemnly here be ye sung, all four elements as one. And so we get the union of fire and water with Homunculus smashing his alembic in fire, mixing with the water of Galatea. And we've also had the fusion of fire and earth with the opening of the previous scene. And then so next with Act 3, we'll resume with Faust in his adventure, concluding with the Helena, which is the first sequence actually that Goethe wrote in all of Part 2.